What's going on, guys? It's the Unhinged Engineer here. If you're a regular viewer of this channel, you likely saw my previous video talking about my SpaceX engineering internship experience. So I went through pretty much everything in that video, starting with the interview experience, ultimately to my trip out to Hawthorne, the work I did, the conclusion of that experience, all that stuff. But the engineering interview process I went through was so difficult that I thought it was worth a video of its own. In addition to the value of that process itself, I also think it's a really good kind of general analog for what you could expect to see at other companies, even if an extreme version of that. But nonetheless, I thought that the SpaceX engineering interview process was worth a separate video of its own, and hopefully it can serve as a survival guide for anyone going through it, or again, a process at a similar company. Like I said, I'm the Unhinged Engineer. I make professional development content for other young engineers like myself. And without further ado, let's talk about the SpaceX engineering interview survival guide I've compiled here. So first, I'm going to talk about the overall format of these interviews. And when I browse the internet and look at other people asking for advice on interviews, I realize that a lot of people are at a loss of what they could expect in general at these companies. Yes, the processes vary a lot from company to company, but there's a general flow to it that you could expect, especially at the top ones. Once we discuss that format, I'm going to go through each round of the SpaceX interview as I experienced them when I was there, give you guys advice on how to perform the best in each of them. Hey guys, Unhinged Engineer here. So I'm actually recording this right after concluding the main recording. A couple of notes here. First of all, I wanted this video to be one part, but it turned out to be like 40 minutes long. So I'm actually gonna split it in two. The first part of this video, which you're likely watching right now, will be about the recruiter screening, the technical screenings, and any online assessments like coding assessments that you might have to do leading up to the on-site. I think the on-site is a good break because largely a repetition of those different rounds I'm going to talk about in the first part of the video, just in person with a couple of other unique things like a presentation, talking to the boss, thinking about how to actually survive 6 to 8 hours of getting grilled in a row. I'm going to have a clean break at the on-site, and that will be the second part of this 2-video series. Second thing I forgot to mention, because I talked about it so much in my previous SpaceX video, is that this is for a GNC engineering internship. So an aerospace related internship, but one that was a bit coding heavy. You know, obviously a pure software engineer or a pure mechanical engineering process might be a little bit different, emphasize different things, but I just want to make clear that this is for a GNC role, and that matters the most for the technical screenings and online assessment I had to do. Let's get back to the main video. I'm framing this video as a SpaceX oriented video as a follow-up to the previous discussion, but a lot of the advice I'm going to give here is applicable to most companies. So mind the clickbait. I definitely think that this is a more broad engineering interview survival guide that you could hopefully apply to lots of different companies, but SpaceX tends to get the clicks, and this is exactly how I went through it when I was there. So disclaimer there, this is applicable in a lot of different places. So in general, most companies are going to follow some kind of flow like this. It's going to start off with a recruiter screening. Those are usually 30 minutes. Really straightforward, as we'll see. At this point, I don't even prepare for recruiter screenings because I've gone through so many. After that, you'll have some kind of online assessment that could either be remote, so like they give you a coding problem, you have to go do it, or live, where you actually sit down with someone, you really do it lead code style. I'm going to focus primarily on the former kind, where you kind of have to do it on your own, because there's a ton of lead code content out there, and to be honest, that's not really my forte. After your online assessment, you'll likely then have a technical screening with an engineer. This is usually 45 minutes to an hour, and it could again either be based on experiences you've had, so kind of a deep dive into the stuff you put on your resume, or more of a hypothetical thing, like imagine you were trying to solve problem X, or tell me what you understand about formula, concept, domain, area Y, whatever. Either of these we're going to discuss here, but this is a technical conversation you're having with another person or several. After that, this is where I break it out into either presentation or behavioral. I'm lumping these two together because this is largely about communication, right? This is where they want to understand, can you articulate your thoughts? Can you compile work that you've done and present it to relevant stakeholders? They're either going to force you to do that in a presentation environment or just kind of ask you questions about it, like tell me a time you did X or Y. And then the last piece is going to be an on-site, which is where you largely repeat the several different rounds I just discussed, just in person and an actual on-site. And that's usually the culmination of these kinds of processes. And after that, hopefully you get your sweet offer. So to kind of talk about what this flow actually looks like at a few different companies, I've listed some examples here, including what it was like at SpaceX. So first one I have here is like a top tier aerospace company that I interviewed at. Pretty long process, bested only by SpaceX itself. But again, started out with recruiter screening, technical online assessment slash coding portion. There was actually a presentation associated with the coding that I had to do. So sometimes that's how it goes. But presented it, went through multiple technical rounds, and then had a final behavioral with the hiring manager, all on site, right? So that's what the gray kind of border means there. I had to do all of those in one day, which, as we'll talk about, is not trivial. So that was at another top tier company like SpaceX. I have a couple other ones listed here. They vary a little bit more because these were actually at startups. So some startups like to mimic the processes of these larger companies if they have the resources and recruiting bandwidth available. Other ones don't really do it so much, and they condense things, focus more on the behavioral, etc. They all have different philosophies around it. This is SpaceX, which was obviously the longest one. So I had the recruiter screening, then an online assessment, which this wasn't live like a leak code type thing, but it definitely was more time compressed, right? I had like a small window in which I could do it, as we'll describe when I get to that round. But after that, a couple of different technical screenings with different engineers on the team, and then the on-site, which was about the same length as the previous one I talked to, because at a certain point, bandwidth becomes a problem when you're doing this in person. So presentation, bunch of different technicals, and then a final round with the hiring manager, or I think that was actually with a skip manager, but we'll talk about how that tends to go. So yeah, as you can see, the processes do vary a little bit, but they do follow this general flow, starting out with the recruiter screening in pretty much every case, getting the coding out towards the beginning, if not immediately after, and then kind of alternating between technicals and presentations, culminating it on site. That's the standard flow that you could expect to see. Okay, now let's go through each round, starting off with the recruiter screening. Before I get to this slide, my biggest piece of advice with recruiter screening is just don't overcomplicate it. These are very straightforward. After you've done the first few, they get really easy. So before I get into any advice, just my biggest piece of advice is don't overthink it. They're dumb simple. Usually it's 30 minutes with a recruiter. It's pretty basic information. Your background, information about the role, logistics, right? Like where you're gonna be working, when they want you to start by, stuff like that. And then hopefully if they give you some actual intel about the remainder of the process. They'll tell you like what's next, what the general flow that they use, stuff like that. A good recruiter is going to want you to succeed, so they're going to try to give you as much information as is necessary for you to do that without obviously making it too easy. They are on your side. The recruiter-recruitee relationship is a complex one worth a video of its own, but my point here is it's really straightforward. They're just giving you super basic information and getting basic information from you. In addition to that, it's largely a vibe check, right? So they're going to be asking you pretty standard questions. Like they're going to ask your elevator pitch, to make sure that you view your own career and your own experiences the same way they do, but also B, that you can actually articulate those experiences and you're going to be a good communicator in the subsequent rounds. I mean, obviously, they're not going to stress you to the degree that subsequent rounds will. In most cases, I have had some jerky recruiter screenings, but for the most part, it's going to be basic. Tell me about yourself. Why are you interested in the company? Why are you interested in the role? Do you have any questions? And then do you have any questions about the interview? That's another common one too. General tips. For one, like I said, it's a vibe check. Come prepared with answers to the questions I just mentioned. It should not take you long to prepare for questions like tell me about yourself. They are as simple as they sound, right? So just take the 10, 15 minutes to kind of rehearse them a little bit so that it rolls off the tongue better. Get to know as much information about the role and interview process as you possibly can. This is a big piece of advice I would give throughout the entire process is whenever you're in round N, try to get information about round N+1, right? It's going to help you. It's going to calm you down. It's going to make your preparation more effective. Just overall, try to be collecting intel when you can during the interview process going into the next one. The last one I'll mention here is salary expectations. Now, I'm not going to discuss salary expectations a ton because this can get pretty intense. And to be honest, I'm not the biggest expert on salary negotiations, right? I know I've made this channel and I talk all about engineering interviews and the different things, but negotiation is still pretty stressful to me, right? Like it's a big deal and there's more qualified people to talk about it. What I will say is a lot of recruiters will try to beat a number out of you right away. There's a lot of reasons they may or not want that number from you, none of which I think are in your best interest to give. So if you're in a state like California or New York, or they just generally posted a range anyway, I would just say that the range is good. That's my standard answer. The range posted on the roll is reasonable to me. That's basically all I say. I don't get into any more detail than that. Whether or not you see yourself as belonging at the lower end of that range or the higher end of that range, depending on qualifications, I would just leave all of that for later. There's kind of this leverage game that goes on. And when you are first starting out in the recruiter screening, they have all the leverage. They haven't invested any resources in you. the team that you're interviewing with doesn't even know who you are yet. So they have all the leverage. So that's probably part of the reason that they want you to give them a number, in the hopes that you give them a low number or they can beat your number down a couple tens of thousands of dollars. In any case, I just kind of punt it. My advice is to avoid discussing salary until later. Now let's talk about the online assessment. At SpaceX, the way the online assessment worked was they gave you a difficult problem, which you couldn't actually see the problem at first. They basically opened up this portal, right? And you could connect to that portal at a certain time. When you connected, you would be able to see the problem that you were being tasked with, and it would trigger a 4-hour window in which you could write a bunch of code and you could test it against different cases they provide you, and hopefully get a good performing algorithm by the end of it. I had a week to do it, and when I clicked go, I had 4 hours after that with no breaks in the middle to come up with a solution, test it a bunch, and hopefully have it work. One thing I'll say, right, this was all pre-LLM, or at least early days of LLMs, where people weren't Claude coding the crap out of everything. So it could have changed significantly. SpaceX has acquired XAI since then, so they're much more AI forward now. I hate using that language, but whatever. Point is, of all the different rounds I'm going to discuss here, this one is the most likely to have changed. So I just want to make that clear from the onset. But in any case, here's some advice. First one is your setup. So I had this hellish experience where I tried to connect. There was a thunderstorm going on, which I think I waited until like the last night to do this because I was still in school. Power and internet connection was spotty. In addition to that, I had to SSH into an AWS instance to run the kind of environment they wanted. It was a whole freaking nightmare that burned probably like 30 minutes to an hour of my interview time, which was not good. Thankfully, I was able to still complete the assignment, but I would have been a little less stressed if I had that extra hour that I burned, setting up a Linux environment and Python interpreter and all this other crap. My point is, make sure your setup works. Test it out. They usually provide some kind of suite in which you can test things if you read it closely, which I did not. So don't be like me. Get all your ducks in a row before clicking that go button so you have as much time as possible. Yeah, this is probably obvious, but allocate the full time. Don't be cocky and waltz in assuming that you can do a 4-hour assignment in 1 hour, because even if you can do that, which the problem was pretty difficult, so I would say, maybe you're cracked and I'm just, not, but most people, as far as I know, take the full time. So assume you're going to take the full time, keep an eye on the clock, bring water, bring food, go to the bathroom beforehand, all that stuff. Assume it's going to take a lot of time and effort, and keep an eye on the clock so you don't burn all your time. Test. This is my next piece of advice. Again, the setups do vary a lot, but the way that this one worked is you would send your code to what I'm assuming is a server, and it would run the test cases using your code, like plugging your code into their larger runner, right? The scaffolding there. And then they would send you back the results of how your algorithm did on that. So people then get this idea of, I don't want to run a bunch of different tests and show them that it takes me multiple tries. These are SpaceX engineers. They realize that you don't get complicated things right the first try. No one's expecting you to divine perfect code into existence, because that's not how real software engineering works, even with LLMs at our disposal today. So use the test cases, right? Not only will they just be a good sounding board and get you to kind of min viable of, hey, this thing is working without crashing early, but also it could give you clues about what might be breaking with your algorithm. Like if it's running well on small test cases, but bombing on large test cases, maybe you have a performance issue. If there's a test case with a 0 in it, or there's a test case where they're all integers instead of floats, you can pick out what is going wrong in different test cases and then use that to actually figure out what's going wrong in your code. So use the test cases. They're your best tool, your best tool for actually coming up with a good solution. Don't write a bunch of code and then you run it the first time and then you get an error and it takes you 10 minutes to fix that one and then you get another error in a different part of the code. Debug as you go and try to get to that min viable as quickly as you possibly can. In case you can't tell, this was not a leak code style question. I mean, it was kind of a leak code style question, but more a sequence of mini leak code style questions wrapped into one larger algorithm for a complex problem. I'm obviously not going to give the problem in this video because that's not really an ethical thing to do. They keep these problems private for a reason, and I don't even know if they use this problem anymore. But my point is, this was more sophisticated than just pure leak code. That said, leak code is difficult as far as I can tell, being a casual leak coder. And so some of the harder ones could serve as a good analog. That's kind of my general proxy for a specific problem there. I think a hard leak code problem or a string of medium leak code problems is a decent way to think about what they asked us to do. Next up, we have the technical screening. So step 0 for the technical screening is gather intel about it before it starts, right? So ask your recruiter during the screening or send an email if you want, whatever. Try to figure out, is it a leak code problem? Because then you know what you got to prepare for. Is it a verbal problem where they're going to ask you some hypothetical, like imagine you have system X and you're trying to solve for this or design that. Like that's kind of a verbal hypothetical type problem. That's the way I think about them. Or is it experience based where they're just going to look at your resume and ask you a ton of questions about your resume and then maybe spin off a couple of hypotheticals based on work you've done. Like tell me how you would change something you did if you had to account for this, just as an example. So get intel from the recruiter. They should be on your side if they want the placement and they want you to succeed. They're trying to fill the role as much as you are. So they are going to give you advice and intel as much as they possibly can without actually giving it away and just kind of cheating against other candidates, right? One other thing you can ask if this is not the first technical screening, like maybe you're doing a sequence of them, they may give you feedback about the previous one. You know, these were some things you really crushed and they took note of. These were some open questions they had and maybe a couple of things that they highlighted as like red flags. Like I have gotten pretty detailed information about not just what I did well, but also what I did poorly from recruiters. Because again, they are on your side, believe it or not, right? So don't be afraid to ask your recruiter for advice or for what you could expect in the next round. In preparation for this round, focus on first principles. I made an entire separate video about preparing for engineering interviews with Claude, but a lot of those tips are kind of AI model agnostic. I think they still apply. Focus on first principle. Don't try to remember everything. This is a big mistake I've made before. In fact, I made it when preparing for the SpaceX interview that this video is titled after. Don't try to remember every specific thing you've ever learned. Focus on the core principles of what you're going to be expected to do on this job. So don't go and try to read 100 pages of a textbook. I quite literally did that, right? This is a GNC role I was interviewing for, and so I took my GNC textbook out from the class I took on it, and I tried to read it cover to cover. First of all, I couldn't read it cover to cover in any significant detail because it was a lot of pages. And second, you don't even need to do that because they're not going to ask you questions about 80% of that information. They're going to ask you about the core concepts that underpin the entirety of that textbook, right? So maybe if you're going to read everything, just read those seminal, probably early chapters where they're laying the groundwork for some of the more sophisticated stuff later. Focus on first principles here. A good interviewer is going to be focused more on how you got to a certain answer than the answer itself, right? So they're not just looking, do they or do they not know the answer? They want to know how you thought through the problem and how you arrived at that answer. So the best way to share that information is to just do it live, right? Like share the information with them as you're thinking through the problem, even before you actually have an answer in mind yet. Great thing to do is ask good questions, right? Ask dumb questions if that's what it takes. Don't be afraid to show that you're thinking because more likely than not, if it's a good interviewer, they're more interested in your thought process than the actual answer you come up with. And speaking of this dynamic, I want to talk about sounding the bottom. So this is a concept I heard of a long time ago that I think is really helpful. So when a submarine or a boat is trying to figure out how deep they are, one thing they commonly do is they send an acoustic signal down, wait for it to hit the bottom of the ocean, and then measure how long it takes to come back up to get a basic range of how deep they are, right? The point of this concept is a lot of times they don't actually care at all what the answer you give is. They're trying to suss out how deep your understanding of what you're talking about actually is. They don't care whether you can answer the question. They're just trying to figure out how deeply you understand the problem. And so recognize that when you're answering the question and when you're sharing that thought process, because that's a really, really important mental frame that's going to change how you think about it. You're going to go from thinking, I don't know the answer and I don't want them to know I don't know the answer, so let me try to mask over the fact that I don't know the answer and change the subject, blah, blah, blah. Like you're going to tune all that out, all that thought process out, a lot of which is inevitable, and you're going to think more so about, okay, regardless of whether I know specifically what they're asking or I've seen the specific problem, they're trying to understand how deeply I understand this area as a whole. And so I'm going to try to share with them as much of that deep knowledge as I possibly have or possibly can while I'm coming up with this answer. Sometimes, and this is something SpaceX did specifically, they're going to keep going until you fail. So it's kind of like that thing 5-year-olds do where they ask you a question that ends in why, and then you tell them the answer and say why. And then you answer again and they say, why? They just keep going. And then sooner or later, the adult gets frustrated. A lot of times they're going to keep going down the stack, for lack of a better word, to deeper and deeper, harder and harder questions until you ultimately fail. Like that is something SpaceX did. And it's really just about doing the dance for as long as you possibly can and showing that you can break down complex problems, especially ones you haven't seen before. So when you get to the end, like ideally, you go back and forth several times, handle multiple whys, answering good questions at each step. And then sooner or later, you're just going to hit a point where you really, really don't understand. Even when you hit that point, or you hit it in any other type of questioning, right? It doesn't have to be this extreme sounding the bottom example, but die on your feet. That's the way I think about it, right? Don't say, I have no idea, and give up, right? Like that's a bad way to end, especially there's going to be that recency bias where that's the last taste you leave in their mouth. You don't want to do that. Like say, honestly, I don't know the answer to this question. I haven't dealt with this kind of stuff before. But if I had to solve the problem, or I had to figure it out, or the first question I would ask is X. When you eventually capitulate, that you really don't know. I think when I hit this point, it was like some question about calibrating potentiometers for different altitudes or something crazy. I had no idea. And I just said, I honestly don't know. I have never worked on calibration in this kind of area, but if I had to think about it, I would think about it this way, and this is my general guess at an answer, or the general question I would ask, right? That's a great way to kind of end it and show, hey, I can do this all day. Even if you actually can't, it's kind of showing that you're game for it and you're likely a good fit at a place like SpaceX as an example. We have gone through the main meat and potatoes of the interview process, right? Because now when we get to the on-site, it's just going to be a repetition of these different types of rounds.